Good morning. Thank you all for joining us. I'm sorry we had some technical difficulties this morning, so we're a little late tuning in this morning, but we are so grateful that you're with us today. On behalf of the Democratic Business Council of Northern Virginia, we are excited to have with us this morning Chris Liu. Chris Liu, as many of you already know, is the former Deputy Secretary of Labor under the Obama administration. He spent 20 years in public service, both in the executive branch and in the Senate and the House of Representatives. He also right now is a fellow at the Miller Center at the University of Virginia. So without further ado, Chris, thank you for joining us this morning.
And thank you. Just adjusting the camera a little bit, and thanks to all of you for your patience. It is good to see. We can see the participant numbers, so it's kind of going up steadily. So we apologize and thanks all of you for your patience.
Well, great. Well, on a personal note, Chris, we first started working together in the Obama administration. You were incredibly helpful while I was at the Department of Veterans Affairs working on veterans issues to make sure that our nation's veterans got the care they deserved. So thank you so much for your continued service. And it is wonderful now to see you on our television screens, most importantly on MSNBC. But if you don't mind just starting out and kind of laying out the picture, where we are right now in terms of the economy and the workforce and what that might look like down the road for us.
Well, the truth is we don't completely know. We've gotten some preliminary indications. Every Thursday, unfortunately, at 8:30, the Department of Labor releases the number of people filing for unemployment insurance. Yesterday, the number went up about 4.5 million. That's now 26.5 million people who filed for unemployment benefits just in the last 5 weeks. To give you a sense of like context of how bad that is, the highest number we ever reached during the Great Recession was around 620,000. So we've been running anywhere from 7 to 10 times higher than that for the past 5 weeks. And so, and there's reason to think that number is even probably understating how bad the economy is, because a lot of people, millions of people have had their hours cut who aren't considered unemployed. A lot of people are still having problems applying for unemployment benefits because it's a process run through all 50 states and territories, and no one thinks to kind of upgrade their unemployment systems until something like this happens. And so if you were to extrapolate this out, I think a lot of people believe the true unemployment rate in this country right now, or what we'll see in the next couple of weeks, is between 15 and 20%. That's, 50% to 100% higher than what we had during the Great Recession. We'll get GDP numbers next Wednesday. Those are going to be, much worse than what we saw during the Great Recession, possibly a 10% drop, perhaps even more than that at this point. Most of leisure, hospitality, retail is shut in this country or operating at very minimal rates. And you're starting to see this kind of ripple effect that's going into other industries like construction and manufacturing. And as Lindsay and I talked before we got online, my concern is that this will now start to hit all of the other, white collar office jobs that I think a lot of people thought were safe because we can telework. And I think the longer this goes on, I think companies are going to start to cut back on lawyers and accountants and consultants. And so I think that's going to help you have a whole nother level of effect of people in this country. I mean, the truth is right now we are in a public health crisis, and until we get this public health crisis resolved, we don't know how bad the economic damage will be. I mean, we've essentially flipped off the light switch on the US economy, and we're not sure we're going to flip it back on. And even when we flick it back on, it's not going to be like everything just turns on overnight. It's going to kind of flicker for an extended period of time. And I know there are a lot of small business owners on this webinar, and I am concerned that a lot of small business owners may not come back, be able to recover after this. And I think that will have an important effect on the workers that are employed by them.
Well, it's definitely been a challenge. And I know I see our participant numbers starting to go up. Please, I just want to remind everyone to submit your questions to Chris At the bottom of your screen in Zoom, there's a Q&A tab. Please submit your questions, and I know he wants to answer as many as possible throughout this next hour that we have him available. Chris, talk a little bit in terms of small business owners. We have a lot of small business owners in the Democratic Business Council in Northern Virginia, but a lot of small business owners that are tuning in and really hurting right now. And we saw last week that many of the loans and resources available to small business owners have run out. Can you talk a little bit about what we should be doing for small businesses in this country?
I mean, the challenge we have right now is that we have a pretty loose definition of what small business is in this country. Technically, it's anything under 500 employees, and even that definition gets stretched for certain industries. And when you're trying to evaluate, like, does your local potbelly count as a small business? Now, and obviously it depends on whether they're franchise, not franchise, whether they're part of a larger a corporation, or do we think about the mom and pop deli, or my neighborhood dry cleaner? I was saying to Lindsay, my neighborhood dry cleaner is now down to operating 1 day a week because no one is bringing their clothes in, and I go in every Saturday and I ask them, did you get your PPP loan? And they haven't been able to do it. And I think one of the challenges is, and as we've seen, and all of you probably have seen in news articles over the last couple of days, starting to see the analyses about, how that money has been given out. There's $350 billion in the first tranche. There'll be a couple $100 billion more in this next tranche, which might last, another week at best. And the problem is, so much of this, the federal government made a decision. We don't have the ability to give out hundreds of billions of dollars of loans. So the way we're going to do this is essentially rely on banks to do that, and then we'll essentially pay banks back afterwards. And what you found with a lot of the large banks, and people on this call may have experienced this, is that not all of their customers were treated the same. You've got very, very large small businesses, which may not even be small businesses, because they had previous lending relationships with these banks, because they already had the financial history. The banks had the financial histories. Those were put in the front of the queue. They got a big chunk of money, and it really didn't leave a lot left for those small businesses that either didn't have the lending relationship or needed more time to get their financial records together. And we should also particularly when you go into immigrant communities, so many small businesses in the immigrant community have really prided themselves on not borrowing money. So they don't have a lending relationship at all. There tend to be cash businesses that don't have these records. And I think we've seen now this dichotomy that's disadvantaged a group of small businesses. And you see this kind of trickle all the way down through the economy. I mean, we've seen, these $1,200 stimulus checks that are going out to people. It works great if the IRS has your bank account number, but for a lot of people who file by paper, IRS doesn't have that. They're going to be mailing out paper checks. There are going to be issues with that. And then you've got a whole group of people in this country that don't operate with banks at all and don't know what they're going to do with these checks that come to them. We also see this playing out in the unemployment system right now, where workers who are in states that have good unemployment systems can apply relatively quickly. If you're in a state like Florida, and there's been a lot of attention on the Florida system, it just doesn't work very well. People have to file paper applications. And then there's a whole group of gig workers who, the Uber drivers, the DoorDash delivery people, who traditionally have not qualified for benefits, who now do and are trying to navigate the system. So it's a little bit of a mess. Congress and I think this was a reasonable decision, basically said, look, we're going to try to push money out the door as fast as possible. And we know there are going to be hiccups along the way. We know that there will be money going to people who shouldn't get them. But instead of trying to make the perfect the enemy of the good, let's just get the money out the door, and then we'll deal with the consequences. And we're now starting to see what some of those consequences look like.
Absolutely. And Chris, we have questions flooding in, so I'm going to quickly turn to our participant questions. The first one's from Nancy. What is your suggestion to recent college graduates and soon-to-be college graduates regarding looking for work? Should they consider taking any job they can? Go to graduate school? What are the options there? Are there any certification courses in an industry that still might be growing despite predicament we're in.
Yeah, I mean, this is part of the problem, and I don't want to give specific career college advice, but I would say this. I mean, we saw this after the Great Recession in 2009, 2010, because so many people, young people, emerged from college with not great job prospects. You saw a lot of them going to grad school, which is actually a good thing in this country, trying to delay entering the workforce as much as possible. Those that entered the workforce during a time of 10% unemployment had a hard time. And they had a hard time because both people were not hiring. But what you also had is at the upper end of the workforce, you had a lot of people who, in 2007 were ready to retire, saw their 401ks dip and decided, you know what, I should work a couple extra years. And as more people stayed in the workforce at the upper end, it decreased some of the options for people at the lower end. And so we had a lot of young people who were not just unemployed, but even those who were employed were underemployed and were doing jobs that that didn't match their education and skill level. My fear is that as this economic downturn continues and goes on for an extended period of time, and I think it will extend, certainly through the end of 2020 and probably through 2021, I think that's going to have an effect on all of these college graduates who not only have seen their senior year disrupted, but I think are going to see job prospects disrupted. Look, more schooling is always a good thing in this economy. More tangible skills are always good, whether it's certifications, whether it's some kind of additional training. But I think I am afraid that there's going to be this kind of similar period of underemployment for the next couple of years for recent college graduates.
Absolutely, it is a tough time. Our next question, Chris, is from Paul. It says, Mitch McConnell has said he wants states to file for bankruptcy, even though that may be illegal. Why does he want to see police, fire, and emergency services damaged? What would be the impact of that on our businesses?
I mean, this is incredible. And those of you who ever watched me on TV, I was on both Morning Joe and Andrea Mitchell talking about this. I mean, this stimulus package that Congress just passed yesterday, $485 billion, no money goes to states at all. We have Andrew Cuomo talking this weekend saying New York is running a $15 billion deficit. Gretchen Whitmer was on TV yesterday saying she's running a $3 billion deficit. States, unlike the federal government, don't have the ability to run deficits. So if you're trying to close $3 billion or $15 billion, you only have a couple of options available to you right now. And more likely than not, you're going to be cutting state employees. That means teachers, that means firefighters, that means police officers. These are people who are often on the front line of addressing, either responding to COVID-19 or dealing with the effects of COVID-19. These are the last people you want to lay off. Let me give you the comparison. In 2009, when Lindsay and I were both in the Obama administration, the $800 billion Stimulus Act, the Recovery Act that the Vice President Biden spearheaded, 1/3 of the money went to state and local governments so that you could avert these kinds of layoffs along the way. And so I am frankly stunned by Mitch McConnell's statement, particularly since he has no similar reservations about bailing out large corporations. But what has been heartening is that, Donald Trump has expressed openness to helping states out, as have Democrats and lots of Republicans. So I think that will happen. And I certainly hope it'll happen because it needs to happen.
Yes, and we've had quite a few people join us since we started. Again, we had some technical difficulties in the beginning. This is the Democratic Business Council of Northern Virginia's signature breakfast. I'm hosting Lindsay Davis Stover, and we are so excited to have with us Chris Liu. Chris is Senior Fellow at the University of Virginia at the Miller Center, and also former Deputy Secretary of Labor in the Obama administration. So for those of you that just joined us after we started, please know that the Q&A box is at the bottom of your screen, and we'd love for you to submit questions. Chris, we're going to continue to go through these questions. They're flooding in right now. James wants to know, what could the Trump administration done better to help our businesses prepare for this time?
We only have 27 minutes. I could go on and on. It's not they could have helped the business prepare. I think they could have better helped this country prepare. Some of you may have seen an important series of stories in Politico about a month ago. If you have not, you should take a look at them. A week before Inauguration Day 2017, January 2017, the outgoing Obama team sat down with the incoming Trump team to do a tabletop exercise of how to plan for crises. And we role-played 3 different crises. One was a hurricane, one was a cyber attack, and one was a pandemic. I was part of that briefing session. We role-played a scenario in which a virus began in Asia and Europe and made its way to the United States, and there were issues about testing and medical equipment and the ability of federal and state response efforts to coordinate. If it all sounds weirdly familiar, it is, because we in the Obama administration had gone through this twice. In 2009 with H1N1, some of you may notice swine flu, 2014 Ebola. So we had, I think, figured out how to deal with these things. We briefed the Trump people on it. We left them a playbook of how to deal with this. The Trump folks themselves did their own tabletop exercise. The intel community had warned them every single year about the importance of this issue. So the problem was that there were the missed warnings, and it was a lack of preparation. It was the missed warnings. You've got a president now who, every day seems to want to blame President Obama for leaving the stockpile empty, which isn't true. But leaving that aside, they had 3 years to sort of deal with all of this. They chose not to do it. And I think some of the interesting analyses recently have found that if the Trump administration had imposed their stay-at-home orders earlier, you could have averted about 90% of the deaths and about 90% of the economic damage. So I think, the president, from dismissing this through most of January and February, I think those will end up being the mistakes that will have, catastrophic ramifications for our country for a long time.
Absolutely. Our next question comes from Catherine. Here in Virginia, we have a stay-at-home order until June 10th. We also saw unemployment go up dramatically. 84,000 Virginians filed for unemployment last week. How do you think we can reopen our state and our country?
Look, it needs to be based on the determination of public health officials. And I give, this is one of the great times where you have having a governor who is a doctor makes all the difference in the world. And I applaud Governor Northam for his strong action. And frankly, I also applaud him for the coordination he's had with Mayor Bowser and Governor Hogan in Maryland. The 3 of them sent a letter out yesterday to the president, basically saying, look, when you're dealing with federal employees, we continue to urge you to have them telework as much as possible, even when you reopen the government. So I think basing decisions on public health officials, having a coordinated regional message helps. Being consistent makes all the difference in the world. You've got a president who is schizophrenic and going back and forth as to what he wants to do. And you've just seen this play out with Georgia, where he seemed to have encouraged Georgia to reopen, now is backing off from that. I think, and so not being a public health official, I will simply say this, which is even when we reopen parts of the economy in the Commonwealth, it's not going to reopen at 100%. And I think we need to understand what the implications of that are. Let's say Governor Northam would say, you know what, restaurants can reopen, but whatever the occupancy was of that restaurant, you can only have half as many people there. Any of you who know restaurants or in the restaurant industry know that you're operating under a very slim profit margin as is. Can restaurants operate at 50% capacity? What about that dry cleaner? What about the local toy store or bookstore that I have up here in Arlington? Can they operate? And they may not be able to. So we're going to have to continue that economic lifeline for a lot of those companies. And what does it mean for workers? If the restaurant can only bring back half of their waitresses, or they bring back all of their waitresses and waiters, they can only work 50% of the hours. How do we make up the difference? We haven't figured those things out. And let's not forget, schools here in the Commonwealth are now closed for the rest of the year. I suspect a lot of summer camps will be closed as well. What do you do for parents who don't have access to safe and affordable childcare? So these are things that are all going to have to be figured out. And again, it's what I talk about. The economy just doesn't flip on like a light switch. It'll flicker for a long period of time.
That's right. And I know a lot of people on this call are probably managing work and homeschool and everything else right now with schools closing. Our next question is from Jim. It says the first 4 stimulus packages were clearly flawed. So many businesses were being left out. What can Democrats do to prepare for the next bill that's being drafted, and what can we learn from what's happened in the past?
Well, look, I think that there have, I think the model of what should happen right now, again, goes back to, we are in a public health crisis. And so we want to address the public health crisis before we address the economic issues. And I think it's fair to say, I mean, I generally don't call these stimulus bills. They're really relief bills right now. The goal is to provide a level of financial stability to both businesses and workers so that they can adhere to these stay-at-home orders without a huge amount of financial disruption to them. Once we're ready to reopen the economy, then we provide the stimulus to them. I think what we've learned along the way is $1,200 check isn't enough for most people. It maybe covers 1 month of rent, if even. It's not going to get you through 2 months. Unemployment is good, but it's kind of a clunky system. For some workers, it will probably give them more money than they would have earned working, which I'm fine with given everything else going on right now. But should a white-collar worker start applying, it's not going to come anywhere near to replacing their income, which is going to have another issue as well. We've seen in the PPP small business loan program, the fact that the big companies have sort of chewed up a lot of the money. That's being sort of fixed in this package. $60 billion in this new package is being set aside for community banks that operate in underserved areas to ensure that more of those mom and pop businesses get money. We really haven't talked that much about the bailouts of large companies. That's another issue that's going to have to be dealt with, and there needs to be more oversight. And we have a president who is trying to evade having any inspector generals kind of look at the way the money is being spent right now. And so I would say continue to provide money to those most affected, small businesses and workers, and put more oversight into the process, and obviously give more money to states to help avert layoffs, and put more money into states for testing, because ultimately, unless you have widespread testing, this problem doesn't get, we can't really safely reopen.
That's right. And just a reminder to all of us joining the call, if you have questions for Chris, please submit them through the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. He's doing a great job of going through all of these questions. Our next question is from Loudoun County. It says, what are your thoughts on the European model of paying the workers directly versus our model of paying the employers? Should we be looking at more of a European model as we move forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably too late to do that now, in the sense that we don't really have the mechanism to make up. I mean, there's not, I mean, we're finding out right now, just in the IRS trying to send checks to people, the problems with checks going, people not having bank accounts, people not having filed their tax returns, so their income isn't recorded by the IRS. So there's not a delivery mechanism right now to pay workers. But I do think as we get out of this crisis, we need to remember how we prepare for the next crisis. And this is the problem we have in this country. I mean, I was in the White House in 2009 during the Great Recession. We saw many of the impacts we're seeing right now, not as quick and as concentrated, but everyone focuses on these things when you're in the middle of the crisis abates, and then people take their foot off the accelerator and sort of stop thinking about this. And so I do think when we come out of this, we need to figure out, is there a better way to compensate workers who are out of work? But also let's consider some of the structural issues. What does it mean when you have a country where there is no national paid sick leave or paid family leave policy? And is it a great idea for people to have to go to work sick, regardless of whether you're in a pandemic or not? or the family leave and not having your ability to take care of sick people. I mean, these are kind of structural things that we need to think about. Or let's think about distance learning, which works fine if you are a family that can afford a laptop and high-speed internet. But what if you can't? And what if your default for getting access to the internet is going to the public library, which is now closed? Fortunately, I'm in Arlington. You could actually, Arlington County has set it up so you can sit in your car in the parking lot outside the Arlington Library and pick up the internet. But we should do better than that. We have to be better than that in this country. Or what does it mean when we have 22 million kids in this country that get a subsidized breakfast or lunch at school? Now, leaving aside the fact that that number is way too high, but what does it mean when schools are closed? And so these are issues that from a societal perspective, we need to address. And because, yes, pandemics don't discriminate based on wealth, but you're seeing the impact of it fall disproportionately on the weakest people, the worst off people in our society.
Absolutely, and you're so right. We have to do better. We just have to. I know in 2008, Chris, you were head of the Obama-Biden transition efforts. And we actually have a question from Catherine in Alexandria. It said, how would you advise Vice President Biden? How should he communicate a clear, comprehensive plan to the voters on what he would do if and when he's elected?
Well, I recommend to all of you who have not taken part in the virtual town halls that he's been doing, please sign up. They're wonderful. And whether he's doing one with Amy Klobuchar, whether he's doing one with public health experts, I mean, it I think shows both his level of empathy, but also his expertise on these issues. I mean, look, I had the chance to work with Joe Biden when we were in the White House. He was the one that ran point on getting $800 billion out the door in 2009 and 2010 as part of the Recovery Act. He was the one that was looking for shovel-ready projects, infrastructure projects. He was the one that was twisting arms of governors and cabinet members to spend money as fast as possible. And so I've seen what he can do in a crisis. And so I think this is the moment that speaks to why competent leadership and why experience matters, and why Joe Biden's 45-year record makes all the difference. And I think it's not just his experience, it's his empathy. Like many of you, I've stopped listening to these Trump press briefings, and I use briefings in quotation marks. I don't know what they are anymore. Yesterday's was particularly, I think, atrocious and dangerous. If you have not seen it, just apparently we're supposed to inject disinfectant into our bodies now. Joe Biden wouldn't do that. Joe Biden would make decisions based on medical experts. But even more than that, he would express some empathy. And I think what you've seen from this current president is a lack of empathy. To the extent he talks about healthcare workers, he's accused them of stealing supplies and saying you should go check where those masks and those ventilators are going. So it's experience, it's empathy, but I think it's also surrounding yourself with very, very good, smart people. Ron Klain, who was Joe Biden's chief of staff in the White House, was our Ebola coordinator, did a fantastic job. Ron is advising him on this. And he surrounded himself really with some of the brightest minds on all of this. And so, look, no administration is ever fully ready for a crisis. We had H1N1 in 2009. We had the Gulf Coast oil spill in 2010. We had Hurricane Sandy in 2012, Ebola in 2014. So no amount of preparations can avoid all of those things, but how you deal with things in the moment, the decisions you make, the people you rely on, your ability to communicate in a clear way to the American people, I think is all critical. And from what I've seen of the vice president, he doesn't need my advice. He's doing it great.
He is. And Chris, the town halls you alluded to have really been fantastic. Last night I attended one, Women for Biden, where Amy Klobuchar was the guest speaker. But for all of our participants that are interested in those, I just would recommend going to the website and finding, one that is of interest to you, because they really are great to be a part of, some great information coming out of it, and additional ways that we can organize, right, in this new normal that we're living through right now.
I mean, one of the funniest moments I saw, and this is such a Joe Biden moment, and it's one of the reasons why we just love him. About a month ago, he did an interview on CNN with, I think, Chris Cuomo, when Chris was still broadcasting from the studio. And Cuomo asked him the question, like, what would you say to the people who are suffering right now or who have lost a loved one? And Biden gives, such a wonderfully empathetic answer based on his own experience losing his kids. And then he says, and then he starts to say, if you need someone to talk to, let me give you my number. And he's about to give out his cell phone on national TV.
Oh.
And you could tell that was not a scripted moment. That's the Joe Biden that those of us who have been had the pleasure of working with know. He's a heart on his sleeves kind of guy who just wants to reach out and help everybody. And that's just what I love, and that's what you see coming through on these virtual town halls.
Absolutely, absolutely. We have several questions that I want to roll into one, Chris. In terms of unemployment, if people are interested to see if they qualify for unemployment, if they're eligible, what are some good pointers you can give to those that might be looking to file for unemployment?
So I would say this, I think the Virginia system, the Virginia website's good. It's not great. And I would simply say no state is great. They're all like, again, as I said, nobody thinks about unemployment systems until you actually need to file for unemployment. I think there was a question in there as to, whether you're semi-retired, you can apply for unemployment. I think the answer is no. But what is interesting, and I think I would go on and read it because it's very, there's sort of the requirements generally. There's a new set of options that came out of the CARES Act. That's the one that passed recently, that gives you the ability to apply for unemployment if you are a gig worker, again, like if you are a Uber driver. It also gives you the ability to apply for unemployment if you're a part-time worker who lost your job. Those generally were not things that applied in the past. As to whether, I think one of the people asked the question, can one be semi-retired and then apply for unemployment? I think the answer is probably not, except if you actually were gaining some income as a, independent contractor doing consulting, and if you could show that your income went down, you may have the ability to do that. So the rules are, it's still not great in terms of the coverage of who can apply for benefits, but there's more coverage now than there certainly was a month ago. So I think it's worth looking at the Virginia website to kind of read carefully about that.
Great. And we have a question from Amy. We've touched on this a little bit, but the future of our workforce could look much different.
Yeah.
We're learning that we can work from home in different ways. Chris, you and I talked about this earlier this morning, right? And even our buying habits and patterns have changed quite a bit. Can you talk about what business owners and what people can do right now to prepare for a changing workforce in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, this is, I think it's going to accelerate a lot of the changes that we had. I mean, if you have gone into a McDonald's recently, you not only have mobile ordering, but you've now got the touch screens. And that is both, those were things that were done largely to save money for McDonald's. But I think, in this era where we want more contactless delivery of food or products, I think you'll start to see those more, and that will accelerate a lot of the automation that's already happening right now. I think a lot of people's, frankly, their buying patterns of products will accelerate. We've seen really over the last decade kind of the collapse of retail in this country, and I think that will be accelerated because, whether it's buying things on Amazon or Walmart.com or whatever it is, or doing a giant Peapod, I think people have gotten used to it. Will say, hey, this is actually pretty good. I should do this. My mother, who's 80 years old, has never used Peapod before and now loves Peapod. So it's hard to imagine her going back into a store again, or it won't go as frequently again. So I think those will change. And I think more broadly, there were a lot of kinks that we needed to work out in terms of teleworking. But I think what we've realized is that you don't really need 100% of your employees in the office at all times. And so I think as we move into this next new normal, where there probably will be social distancing at offices, and people will say, look, I only want half the people to come in, so we're going to alternate days coming into the office. Or look, if you really don't need to be in, you don't need to come in at all. And so I think that's going to have impact on how we communicate with each other, because I'm fine with Zoom, but it's not quite the same thing as being in the office, and I do miss that human interaction. But I think it's also going to have implications for office space in this country as well. And so I guess my short answer to the question is we've seen a lot of technological changes over the last couple of years. I think what this will do is accelerate all of those changes. And I think we need to get used to operating in a much more digital fashion, much more remote fashion with people.
Right. We're going to take our last participant question from Eddie. It says, what are your views on Northam's forcing the state to delay the increase in the minimum wage and begin collective bargaining in the public sector? How are they justified or even related to the virus?
So I'm of two minds of this. I am, obviously I spent a good chunk of my time in the Obama administration pushing for an increase in the minimum wage, and I currently sit on the board of the American Sustainable Business Council, which represents 250,000 businesses that actually believe in increasing the minimum wage. And so I was happy and thrilled that the General Assembly and the State Senate raised the minimum wage, as well as all the other progressive things that they did. And I just as a tangent, if you need any proof about why electing Democrats matter, just look at this last legislative session down in Richmond, between gun safety laws and Election Day being a national holiday, to pro-worker initiatives, to greater protections for LGBTQ citizens of the Commonwealth. I mean, these are all important progressive changes. I wish the governor had not done that. I think in terms of delaying these things, I understand why he did. I think it too conveniently suggests that, minimum wage, collective bargaining are somehow bad for businesses. I tend to believe that, it helps you attract your employees, retain your employees, keep them more motivated. I understand why he did it, but I frankly wish he had not done it, because I think it kind of feeds into these narrative that these things are not necessarily, that these things are certainly disruptive to business, which I don't think that they really are. So. Right.
Well, I know our time together is coming to an end, so I'd like to just end on a bright note, something light. What is something that you've discovered or rediscovered during this time, whether it's a good book, a movie, what has been something that you've really enjoyed being able to discover?
You know what, I actually, well, let me just say two things. One is, while I miss the human interaction with people, Zoom and Skype have been a fantastic way to catch up with friends I haven't talked to in forever. And so, like many of you, I'm probably doing way too much virtual happy hours. And I am certainly glad the governor declared liquor stores an essential business, because I've certainly been perusing them. But it has been fun to catch up with friends I've not talked to in a long time. And I think what I have just loved is actually just going out for walks. And, I can't go to the gym anymore, which I love going to, but just like going for a walk around the neighborhood and just kind of taking nature in, and, safely social distancing on all the trails near our house. And so that's been kind of fun. It's, in some ways, it's been a much more hectic pace or unpredictable pace, but in some ways it's been kind of a chance to kind of just like, take a little bit of a break and sort of observe what's happening around you a little bit more acutely.
Well, I have to say, Chris, I listened to a podcast you were on recently, my 10-year-old daughter, and you mentioned that you had gone, was it 2 years or even longer of getting 10,000 steps a day, every day. And so because she heard that on this podcast, she has now challenged me to getting 365 days of 10,000 steps or more. So that has been something I have been discovering during this time.
I'm weirdly obsessed. I've got a watch that tracks my steps, and I think I'm on day 1,000 and something right now. And actually, frankly, it's been good, because in these unpredictable times, you just need some sense of routine. You need to you need to go to bed at a decent hour. You need to get up at a decent hour. You need to find some exercise. You need to find some time with family and friends, even if it's remote. So routine is especially important in a time like this.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Chris, so much for sharing your morning with us. on behalf of the Democratic Business Council of Northern Virginia, we're very grateful. And I know all that participated this morning, we had some great questions. So thank you for joining us. And we hope to have you back when things do get back to normal.
Absolutely.
And we all meet together for breakfast.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, Lindsay. And thanks to all of you for making the time.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us.